I think at minimum, the UK will probably manage to overtake Canada as worst performing developed country over the next 4 decades.
Reform is led by the man who took Great Britain out of the European Union.
So I think that makes Britain singular and worthy of tremendous admiration.
The aim of reform is to bring back classic liberals and the moderate right.
Nigel Farage, who is the man who took Great Britain out of the European Union with Brexit, and who now runs a political party in the UK called Reform.
The foundation of identity must be reclaimed and oriented correctly.
The aim of Reform is to shake the Conservatives up, let's say, and return the classic liberals and the moderate right to something approximating, what would you say, an orientation that's actually based on the fundamental principles of Western civilization itself.
British common law translated biblical narratives into effective policy.
Judeo-Christianity at the bottom, the democracy that emerges out of that as a consequence of the concept of the sovereignty and divine import of the individual, the family above that, the community, the city, the state, the nation, under God, that entire subsidiary structure, to return to an orientation that makes that primary and the foundation of identity itself.
British common law stands as a monumental achievement, says Jordan.
It probably did the most effective job of any modern state of translating the narrative structure of the Judeo-Christian biblical corpus into policy. And it did that partly explicitly in its parliamentary structure, but it also did it even more wisely with its common law tradition.
If globalist liberals have overrun conservatives, what hides in Labour's shadows?
I mean, English common law is a complete bloody miracle. Bottom-up law. I mean, God, what a phenomenal accomplishment.
I'm watching with apprehension as the UK populace wanders over the brink, going to elect a Labour government in all likelihood.
Self-governance will distill Britain's thoughts and aspirations.
This concerns me a lot, because if the Conservatives have been overrun by globalist liberals with a progressive agenda, I can't imagine who's lurking in the background on the Labour side. Well, I can imagine because I worked in universities, so I actually know exactly who's lurking in the background. And so I'm very apprehensive about what a Labour government will do to the UK.
Jordan claims that the UK will probably manage to overtake Canada as the worst performing developed country.
And the hopes and aspirations of those that voted for them, and I gave them considerable help with that victory, the thoughts and aspirations were that with self-government, the numbers coming into Britain would reduce. With self-government, illegal immigration could be effectively dealt with. And another crucial group, 5.5 million men and women running small businesses, acting as sole traders, believed that the massive regulatory rule book that had been put on top of everybody, taking away their time, their effort, that could be reduced so that we could encourage entrepreneurship, we could encourage real economic growth. And so the Conservatives were riding on the crest of a wave, and many said, well, I mean, Boris Johnson will be Prime Minister for 15 years. And what has happened over the last 5 years, in my view, is they have betrayed all of those hopes in absolutely every way. Elected as Conservatives, but they've governed as metropolitan Liberals. They introduced net zero policies. I mean, so insane was some of it that Boris even suggested that we take out of production 30% of our farmland and rewild it. When it came to getting rid of regulations, basically nothing was done. In fact, arguably, for many sectors, they're now living under more bureaucratic control now than they were as members of the European Union.
The government abandoned plans to turn legislation into asylum centres. These English politicians, they speak separately from people.
This is a situation in Ireland that's been developing probably since November 2022, when the government here decided to abandon all planning legislation, allow office buildings to be turned into asylum centres, mainly for single males in the 18 to 30 kind of category, and impose those centres into mainly working class communities which are already devoid of any real services and are abandoned in general by the political and NGO class. And we have in Ireland now a country that's run by politicians who are more interested in what their European masters think of them than they are about the Irish people. We have a political and NGO class which is beholden to woke liberalism, and we have, you wouldn't believe, in this country 33,000 NGOs who receive 6.5 billion euro per year and employ around 200,000 people to lobby government.
And the big one is legal immigration. And just to give people some context on this, in the late 1940s, it was very much felt that we owed a huge debt to the British Empire, British Commonwealth, because in two world 40% of the contribution came from the Commonwealth. Canada, of course, your home country, being one of the most remarkable of them. And so began legal immigration from the West Indies and elsewhere. And it ran all through the late 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, right up until Tony Blair got in. It ran all through that period with a net migration level of 30 to 40,000 people a year.
Murray is worried about the United Kingdom in these circumstances.
Malachy, how does this happen? We've got an audience here yesterday, over the weekend and today who are looking at this and saying this wouldn't be allowed to happen in England. And these politicians, they speak separately from people. People feel totally detached on this, that they have no say in this whatsoever. How does this situation come about that the politicians are so out of touch?
There's a total disconnect between the Irish political class and ordinary people. If you look at what happened last week, for instance, on Monday, now the protest in Coolock has been going on. There's been people sitting outside that protesting in the camp for 3.5 months. With no violence, no difficulties, and the police moved in at 3:30 on Monday morning and moved them out. And that led to some difficulties during the day, and there was a JCB digger burnt out. But what exacerbated the situation was that the Gardaí, and the people who are doing what they call rioting, and you come from the North, Eamon, the rioting in Dublin, wouldn't even merit the name riot in Belfast.
The woke liberals claim migration is essential for the health service.
There'll be a monarchy. I would worry about the United Kingdom in these circumstances. As you say, Piers, I mean, the gains Sinn Féin made in the local elections, historic gains, should be troubling to anyone who is, like me, a unionist. Sinn Féin, of course, is an Irish nationalist party and is as well, in my own view, an extremist party. And that isn't mere rhetoric. Mary Lou McDonald, the head of Sinn Féin, has an unbelievable track record. I mean, just that you mentioned these earlier, there's only one statue to in Europe, and it sits in the park in Dublin. Sean Russell, an IRA member who was on a German U-boat in 1940. There's a statue to him in Dublin, and Sinn Féin always pay their respects there. Mary Lou McDonald, a couple of years ago, was taken there to pay her respects. She was, as it were, bloodied by the more militant wings of Sinn Féin. That's totally normal in Sinn Féin history. It's not just that they were an extremist party in the past, it's that they are in the present. It's not just that they're Irish nationalists, that they are actually extreme Irish nationalists, violent Irish nationalists, always have been, and seem to continue to be. I think it's an incredibly worrying development. As you say, alongside the the ongoing success electorally of the Scots nationalists in the north, it's certainly possible we could see the breakup of our country. It's something where I think everyone who recognizes that the United Kingdom's been an enormous force for good in the world should really be very worried about. We should be very troubled by that.
Jordan warns of the havoc a Labour government could wreak on the UK.
Well, we've gone from a population of 3.5 million to a population of over almost 5.5 million now, without building any infrastructure to deal with that. We have a shortage of hospitals, we have a shortage of schools, but most particularly we have a shortage of housing. We have 14,000 people in emergency accommodation, Irish nationals in emergency accommodation. The average price for a new house in this country now is about 450,000, which Dublin City Council somehow thinks is affordable. We have average rents for a one-bedroom apartment in Dublin, €2,000, a three-bedroom house, €3,500. And the woke Liberals will tell us, oh, well, we need migration to run the health service. Well, if we didn't increase the population the way we did, the health service wouldn't be under the strains it's under. And also, our own doctors and nurses are being forced to emigrate because they can't afford to live here. So if they could stay, we wouldn't need to import the people. But we've a class that believe, and they talk about international obligations and the law. As far as I'm concerned, the government's obligation is to its own people. And we had the ludicrous situation, for instance, of the High Court in Dublin saying that the Irish government couldn't deport anybody back to the UK because of the Rwanda policy. You know, and they said that the UK was not a safe country to return people to.
I'm absolutely jaw-droppingly amazed that the Conservatives adopted net zero policies under Boris Johnson. It's like, what the hell were they thinking? You know, the most skeptical part of my brain, and I suppose the rude part, thinks that this was cooked up by Boris Johnson to impress his young wife on the personal side, and that the Conservatives as well as a group lacked a vision so comprehensively that they had to turn to this idiot climate apocalypse mongering that's used by power-mad tyrants to cow the public into delivering them all the authority and power.
The centre-right must be reshaped to reflect the silent majority's voice.
And so, what do you think a Labour government will do to the UK?
Yeah, I mean, Keir Starmer has no leadership qualities whatsoever. He is devoid of any sort of charisma at all. And people do need a leader, that inspires them to a certain degree. He's kind of doing well because he's not the Conservatives, and there is revulsion. There is revulsion at them, a sense of betrayal about them. On the face of it, his manifesto on climate change is almost identical to the Conservatives. His manifesto on economics is almost identical to the Conservatives. But I think we know that what we'll see is trans ideology in the ascendancy. We'll see more legislation designed to divide us up into different groups rather than bring us together as human beings equal before the law. I look at his potential front bench of the top ministers. I see very little competence whatsoever. He's almost going to win by default, as opposed to, a big, enthusiastic wave of support. And so in some ways, I think there's every opportunity for this just to be a one-term Labour government. There'll be no honeymoon. There'll be no sort of after-victory glow. He faces a big set of problems, the ones I mentioned earlier, the population explosion, the fact our public services don't work, the fact young people can't get a house and even their rents take up over half of their income. And he won't have the solutions to any of it. He's campaigning on a slogan of change, but actually it'll be more of the same, just ever so slightly worse.
Anti-oppression activists in the US decry UK colonialists due to the UK's success.
So here's the opportunity. The opportunity is to reshape the centre-right of British politics, to be where the silent majority actually are. Now, I know that the British Conservative Party had been around for 190 years. But nothing necessarily lasts forever. And what I'm doing with Reform UK is I am taking those stances on all of those issues that I think give us the kind of radical change that we need. And I use the word radical in an old-fashioned sense of the word. You see, I'm a traditionalist. I think that our culture matters.
Breaking up into these sort of mini national states within the United Kingdom, I think, would be a disaster.
So first of all, we have to accept to some degree that the willingness to use power and compulsion and to keep is relatively ubiquitous across the entire human family, let's say, and that opposition to that emerges with difficulty and rarely. And then you have to ask yourself, what are the preconditions for that kind of opposition? And it was certainly the case with Wilberforce, as far as I can tell, that he was driven by the conviction that all men and women are made in the image of God, and that it was a violation of a transcendent ideal that in and of itself was the violation of a transcendent ideal. And that is something that's deeply rooted in the Christian tradition. I have tried to think my way around this, right? Because I don't like to multiply unnecessary metaphysical presumptions. But I can't see at all that opposition just would have emerged the way it did in Britain if it wouldn't have been able to draw on a well of metaphysical and religious presupposition that was predicated on the idea that each person has a soul, and that that soul in some manner has a divine value. And so, yes, I think that makes Britain singular and worthy of tremendous admiration.
Britain's governance legacy worldwide is no mere accident, believes Jordan.
You know, the anti-oppression people in the US who decry the UK colonialists in particular for their oppressive policies are spitting in the face of the only political system that ever successfully controlled, and not only practically because of the British Navy on the high seas, but also metaphysically and politically. Like it was the British who decided, hands down, that was wrong, and then did something about it. And that was documented historical reality. The reason for that is because the British parliamentarians were called to their conscience by English evangelical Christians, essentially, Wilberforce in particular, who said, by the doctrines that you claim to regard as holy, this should not stand, and therefore can't. And Britain did that, and the Brits as well, even in relationship to the empire. It was at the same period of time that the Brits were already deciding that colonial rule in India had to be aimed towards the emancipation of the Indian people and their elevation as responsible individuals to the realm of sovereign citizenship. And that's an amazing thing for an empire to conclude. And you can be cynical about the lag of time it took, but it didn't take that long. And India's doing pretty damn well. And I think that the British bequested their gift of governance all around the world. And that's not fluke, and they deserve credit for it. And it would be a catastrophe for Great Britain to fall down the rabbit hole of self-abnegation and not realize that it's an amazing place. I mean, there's no US without the UK. I mean, the Americans like to think that, the tradition of freedom in the US is the American Revolution. It's complete bloody nonsense. And we knew that in Canada because we knew that what the Americans did in their revolution was fight for the rights of Englishmen. And that is what they did. And that doesn't take away from the American Revolution, but it links what happened in the US to, a historical progression that had gone on for centuries before that, and that was unstoppable, right? And that was the revelation in the political space of the Judeo-Christian revelation, fundamentally, as far as I can tell.
And so I just can't wrap my head around the conservative shift to net zero, not only because it's such a profoundly anti-conservative movement, at least with regards to such things as entrepreneurial activity and freedom, And it's profoundly anti-subsidiary, so it works against the spirit of distributed responsibility. And the economics of a shift to net zero are so appallingly catastrophic that it's a miracle that anybody who could count would even ever consider it. So, like, what the hell was going on with and certainly this is part of the reason they're being devastated at the moment. What in the world was going on with the Conservatives? Where were their heads at?
If anyone thinks that all of this just glides by endlessly without any political consequence, I'd just say, raise your eyes a little and look to the continent. They're offering people the best chance they'll ever have in their lives to get to civilization, or civilization to get to them.
Some people wished for chaos, only to be proven wrong along the way.
I've no particular desire for the worst things I diagnose and worry about happening, coming to be. I mean, I think there are some people who are so incredibly narcissistic that they would rather the world went to hell as they predicted than that they would prove wrong along the way.
We pretend that the opposite in reverse is not going to have any implications and consequences.
And yet we pretend that the opposite in reverse is not very interesting, not going to have any implications and not have any consequences. It's all going to keep going on. I just don't think it will.
Murray wishes more people could take the attitude that he has taken throughout his life.
And when people rail against things like this city we're sitting in, think that it epitomizes capitalism and patriarchy, racism, more and more, I wish more people could take the attitude that I've taken throughout my life to these things, which is, you don't have to be tub-thumping, you don't have to be a wild flag-waving patriot or anything like that.
Murray urges that your attitude should be gratitude.
But your attitude should be gratitude. I mean, it's not as if this is nothing. The city we're sitting in is enough for a whole lifetime, and a very, very well-lived lifetime.
He insists this problem can't be enforced by government.
This can't be done by government diktat. It can't be done because the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of Great Britain says that it should be so. There are certain things they could not do that might make it easier, but this just comes from people.
Immigration issues are the result of generational political failure.
Well, obviously, it's a political failure, a generational political failure that's just sped up in recent years. That it has happened, as you said, under consecutive leaders who've promised that exactly this wouldn't happen is a disaster for Britain. Quite what a disaster it is, I think we can already start to see.
The continent shows that immigration has serious political consequences.
I remember when Giorgia Meloni was described as this far-out, far-right political leader in Italy, and she's now Prime Minister. I remember when Geert Wilders was described as this far-out, far-right political figure who wasn't even allowed into Britain in 2009 by a Labour Home Secretary. And now he's the main party leader in the Netherlands. So if anyone thinks that all of this just glides by endlessly without any political consequence, I'd just say, raise your eyes a little and look to the continent.
For the first time, a border force is returning migrants to France.
A border force takes migrants back to France for the first time. Wow, that's amazing. Border force took migrants rescued from the Channel back to France for the first time yesterday, because the Prime Minister says, or as the Prime Minister says, he wants an asylum seeker returns deal with Europe. Now, this is an unprecedented step, I think it's fair to say, actually. 13 asylum seekers were taken to Calais. Now, what does this mean? Does it actually signal a closer relationship between Britain and France, an entente cordiale? And of course, this comes when the EPC is meeting as well. And of course, Keir Starmer all over the leaders of the European countries.
This week, we hit the milestone of over 1,000 migrants crossing via the Channel in a week. Now, on Monday, there were 427. They crossed in 7 boats. On Thursday, 317 on 6 boats, and another 413 on 7 boats on Friday. Now, that's a total of 1,157, plus 85, I think, today. Sadly, in between that, we also heard of the deaths of migrants, and others were rescued. Amazingly, though, one boat was turned back in French waters.
The parties have been talking about immigration, but what does the public think? Well, an exclusive poll for Sky News has found that across the country, 43% of people asked thought that immigration has a negative impact on British society. That's compared to 35% here who say it has a positive impact. So clear difference there. And there are also clear differences between age groups. 54% of 18 to 24-year-olds thinks that immigration has a positive effect. But the older you get, the lower this number comes down. When you get to 65 and over, only 20% of these people thought immigration is good for society. And the results vary according to location. Actually, it's only in London and in Scotland that people were more likely to say that immigration has a positive impact. So the lighter the colour here, the less supportive people are of immigration. You see that band here, Northern Ireland not included in this survey.
Reform is the only party seen as honest about immigration views.
But the poll also revealed deep political distrust among the public. 52% of people said they think Labour aren't telling the truth about what they really think about immigration. Not much better for the Conservatives, only 49% here, so not a big difference, saying the same thing about them. The Lib Dems doing slightly better, maybe they spelled it out better. But every region, every demographic distrusted the main two parties here on this point. The exception here, Reform UK, the only party people think are telling the truth about their views on immigration. 60%, big number, agree the party was saying what it genuinely thought. That doesn't mean they necessarily agree with the public, but they do think they're saying what they think. And the people don't really trust the main two parties to follow through on their promises. People thought that immigration would increase under both a Labour, that's what they're talking about here, and under the Conservative government, whatever it is, despite believing that the policies of the parties is to reduce it. And finally, respondents also thought that cutting immigration would have a negative impact on the NHS, on hospitality, and on social care, but a positive impact here on housing and the housing crisis. So how do we take all that together? Well, the public understands that cutting immigration would hurt those very important sectors. So does it want politicians to be honest about that and cut immigration anyway? Or does it want to do the same things as the parties are doing, saying that immigration is too high, but to avoid damaging those sectors, keep it high while still complaining?
Murray urges us to live the good life we fought for until yesterday.
My own view is that it should partly be done by living the life that we thought to be a good life until yesterday. We're very unlikely to come up with an entirely new definition or invention, very unlikely that we're going to invent new gods, very unlikely we're going to come up with new religions, very unlikely we're sitting here in Florence, very unlikely we're going to be able to do anything this good again. So why don't we have the recognition of what a good life was that was very recognizable until yesterday? Now, that can't be done. Roger Scruton and I were talking about this recently. This can't be done by government diktat. It can't be done because the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of Great Britain says that it should be so. There are certain things they could not do that might make it easier, but this just comes from people. It comes from individuals and people leading by example. When I discuss many of the things that came up in The Strange Death of Europe, sometimes people say to me, you seem, well, some people say, but you don't seem as het up about it. And that must mean that you know it's over, because otherwise you would be more.
Yes, there's a difference between fight and resignation.
Yes.
There's a difference between those two.
And you work out, don't you, as an adult, what it's worth wasting yourself on, and what points you should keep making, and when you've made them enough, and when you've hit your head against that wall enough, and you just have to work it out. And I've said everything I can to try to warn my fellow countrymen and Europeans and Americans and others who've taken the book to heart of what I think is happening. But I don't intend, I've done my best shot at it. And my own view is that after that, you have to live the life that you ought to live in the civilization you enjoy. And you see, it's more than enjoyment, obviously, isn't it? One of the problems, one of the things I wish one could communicate better to people is that all the things that they think are excluding people are not. They're offering people the best chance they'll ever have in their lives to get to civilization, or civilization to get to them.